Hello everyone, this is Mr. O'Brien and welcome to the presentation, The Civil War, 1861 through 1865, through maps, charts, graphs, and pictures. The intent of this presentation is to give you sort of an overview of the war, not to get really into the nitty-gritty. That's more for in class. So the first thing we need to realize as the war began in 1860 is that the North had a distinct advantage because they had more railroad lines. So soldiers and officers did not anticipate how technological advances changed warfare. The Civil War was the first major conflict in which the railroad moved troops and supplies. It really was in many ways the first modern war. The telegraph, observation balloons, and even hand grenades and submarines, metal submarines, were used for the first time. Most important was the revolution in arms manufacturing, which replaced the musket. The musket, accurate only at a short range, it was replaced with the rifle, deadly at 600 or more yards because of its grooved barrel. This changed the nature of combat, making far more important heavy fortifications and trenches, and giving defensive forces, usually the Confederates, a significant advantage. This development produced the awful casualties of the war's battles. Now, medical care was primitive, especially at first, and large numbers of Americans for the first time were captured and held as prisoners of war in camps, leading to high death rates. At least 620,000 died in the war, the equivalent of more than 6 million in today's population, and more than the entire number of Americans killed in all other wars in U.S. history, from the Revolution to the Iraq War. Now, besides railroad lines, the North had the advantage in almost every other category as well. If you look up here, they had more workers, they had more factories, they were able to manufacture at a greater rate. Again, the railroad tracks. They made more textiles, a lot more firearms, 32-to-1 ratio, and a 20-to-1 ratio in the making of pig iron, or a type of metal. Now, to be sure, both sides were unprepared for war. So even though the North was more prepared, they were both unprepared. There was no national banking system, there was no tax system to raise revenue for the war, and few accurate maps of the South existed. So after Fort Sumter, Lincoln enacted a blockade of the South intended to destroy its commerce, but the Navy at first had few ships to enforce it. The problem of purchasing and distributing food, weapons, and other supplies for the armies were huge. While the Union Army eventually became the best fed and best supplied force in history, Southern soldiers lacked food, uniforms, and shoes. Lacking sufficient industrial capacity, the Confederate government imported many items for the military from abroad and established its own arsenals. The need to generate revenue to pay for the war transformed America's financial system. To raise funds, the national government increased the tariff to record levels. They imposed new taxes on production and consumption, and they passed the first income tax in American history. They amended the Constitution to do so. It also printed more than $400 million of paper money called greenbacks as legal tender. So it went a long way to modernizing our economic system. Wartime economic policies handsomely benefited Northern manufacturers, railroad businessmen, and financiers. Many, quote, captains of industry of the Gilded Age, which we will study later on, made their fortunes in the war, including iron and steel man Andrew Carnegie, oil magnate John D. Rockefeller, financier Jay Gould and J.P. Morgan, and Philip Armour, beef slaughterer. As a whole, Union economic policies vastly expanded the power and size of the national government. The federal budget in 1865 was more than $1 billion, 20 times larger than 5 years earlier, 1860, and the national government became the nation's largest employer. So just to give you an overview of who is who at this point in 1861, the northern states, meaning the free states, you see up here in the golden color. Now remember, there were 4 slave states in the upper South that never left the Union: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. Now, to be sure, Lincoln was very cognizant or very aware of their presence. He was afraid of alienating them in the war and losing them to the South. So many of his early decisions, especially those that seemed to be pro-slavery, and in fact were pro-slavery, were due to his fear of losing them or alienating them to the South. Now we get to the Confederate States. We have the first 7: South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Fort Sumter happens, and after Fort Sumter, we wind up with Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. So we have 11 southern states seceded the Union by 1861, by May 20th, 1861. Now let's look at an overview of the occupational makeup of both the North and the Southern soldiers combined. You can see that 48% were farmers, so about half of the military of both the North and the South were farmers. About a quarter of them were mechanics, which remember means working with your hands, artisans. So farmers and artisans made up about 75% of the military force. We have 16% laborers, meaning wage workers, which remember was shunned, was a sign of unfreedom. We have about 5% businessmen or merchants. We have 3% professionals, doctors, lawyers, and merchants. Moving on to take another look from a different angle of how heterogeneous or homogeneous the militaries were. If you look at the North versus the South, and again, this is to get another layer, another idea of the makeup of each military. This slide tells us the North and the South, at least ethnically, were different. Most Southerners were your white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. If you look at the map here, less than 10% of the South, with the exception of Louisiana, because remember, New Orleans is in Louisiana, but most other states, all other states in the Confederacy, less than 10% of the state was made up of immigrants. Now, if you go to the North, look at the Northwest Territory over here, Illinois, Indiana, about 10 to 19% was made up of immigrants. If you get to Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, and Connecticut, and Vermont, you have 20 to 29% of those states made up of immigrants. So the population up north was more diverse than the population down south, and it reflected that in the military. The military makeup was more diverse as well. So just to remind you of the leaders of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis was elected as the president, and Alexander Stephens was elected as the vice president. Now you may remember Stephens from the Cornerstone speech, in which he very explicitly stated that this revolution, meaning this secession, was an attempt to maintain their way of life, slavery. The next two slides are more or less meant to be a montage of the different generals used both by Lincoln up north and by Davis down south. We begin with Winfield Scott. Next, we have Irwin McDowell. We have George McClellan, who eventually runs against Abe for the presidency. We have Ambrose Burnside, who, by the way, is the origin of the phrase sideburns. We have Joseph Hooker. We have George Meade from Gettysburg. We have George McClellan again. And finally, Ulysses S. Grant, who goes on to become president eventually. Now let's get to the Confederate generals. Stonewall Jackson is the first, and he got his name because he becomes a hero early in the war, and he was said to stand there in battle like a stone wall, an impenetrable stone wall. We have George Pickett, again of Gettysburg. We have James Longstreet. We have Nathan Bedford Forrest, who, by the way, becomes the founder of the Ku Klux Klan, and also a relative of Forrest Gump. We have Jeb Stuart, and we have Robert E. Lee, who eventually surrenders to Grant.